everyone. So excited to see you. Really excited to be here. Again, last year was fantastic. I think this is definitely even better. My name is Lerner. I am the CEO of Climate Collective. We are a growing community of entrepreneurs, investors, scientists, and nonprofits, all working to accelerate climate action at scale. We have a really interesting panel today. I'm very honored to be speaking alongside these experts. So we'll just get started. I'm not going to give you their whole bios. They're on the website, but they've done some really interesting things in their lives. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. We are talking broadly about corporate commitments. I think you've all seen news reports and more ambitious commitments, new policies trying to hone in to what commitments should look like, better types of recognition for commitments, but also a lot of pushback on credibility of commitments, of claims, of impact. This is obviously a really interesting conversation. The panel just before us covered a lot of the sort of high-level policy pieces to that. We're going to go a little bit more specific and talk about what we're seeing on the ground, what some of our clients are doing, and what our respective organizations are doing to drive integrity here. All right, I'm going to start actually with Caitlin. So Caitlin Smith is a manager of carbon markets at Rocky Mountain Institute. And my question is really focused on just setting the stage of the voluntary carbon market. The voluntary carbon market represents a really important lever for us to accelerate climate action. It's still a voluntary market, which offers a lot of challenges, particularly for those of us operating in the United States. So I'd like you to just anchor us again and remind us, why is the voluntary carbon market so important?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And I think it's helpful to start at what problem we're trying to solve. And so we've heard a lot of numbers this morning, right? But at its core, climate change is a market failure. Emissions are not priced. One of the best explanations of the voluntary carbon market I've heard is it is a way to price emissions everywhere that doesn't have policy to do so, which, let's face it, is most of the world. And definitely most of the places that need a lot of investment. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that we've heard a lot of conversation this morning about avoidance, removal, net zero, all these huge words. The reality is, to get where we need to go, we need new technologies, we need new business models, we need new government finance models that have a price on carbon, right? Where carbon has a value, and that value is baked into how we make decisions. The voluntary carbon market right now is the only mechanism that we have and that we are building that is figuring out how to do that and how to create the incentives that are needed to get to where we need to go. And then I think the most important thing is we are all aware that we have, I think David this morning said it's about 8 years before we blow the carbon budget. We all see the headlines every single summer, every single winter, they get worse. Climate impacts are here, they're getting worse. And we kind of need an organic solution equal to the urgency of the problem. And the market mechanism is the most effective and efficient way that humans have ever invented to allocate finance to problems we need to solve. That's why the voluntary carbon market, I think, has generated the headlines, gotten the investment, and is so important in this moment in time.
That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Sarah, turning to you, obviously operating a lot across the voluntary carbon market as the Chief Growth Officer at Gold Standard. Last week we saw Bain and World Economic Forum, and we mean Business Coalition, come out with this new report that talked about what are some of the learnings or some of the tactics, if you will, that we can use to drive corporates up what they call the adoption S-curve for commitments across the voluntary carbon market, and really help corporates find recognition and motivation to allow this market to take off. I would like you to talk a little bit about how Gold Standard is supporting this drive towards more adoption, more activity across the market.
Sure, thanks, Anna. Gold Standard is fundamentally about creating trust and integrity so that companies can have the confidence to move up that S-curve. So what we are looking at is to provide, ways to create value from investments in carbon credits, and that's not just for climate mitigation, for avoidance, reductions, removals, but also for sustainable development. So we think there's a really important story that sometimes gets overlooked on what the power of climate finance can do. It's really important in managing to our global carbon budget, but it's also about climate justice. And so I think one of the roles that Gold Standard really plays, in addition to advocating for, insisting that every company should be held accountable for its carbon pollution, is to demonstrate how that investment in carbon credits or other mechanisms to drive finance can also unlock development opportunities in a really rigorous and quantifiable way, similar to, just as rigorous as the carbon methodologies. So that's one kind of untapped opportunity, I think, that we need to remind companies that not only can you help cut carbon, but you can really contribute to a just transition at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. Michael, you are an energy transition attorney at Latham Watkins, and obviously sit very close to a lot of these deals, advising a lot of your clients on what to buy, how to structure these investments. So let's be a bit more specific for a second. In light of the VCMI process, we heard Mark just before talk about it on stage, the CORSIA phase 1 changes, the core carbon principles coming out of the ICVCM, what type of credits might we expect corporates to procure in light of all of these changes? What are you seeing?
So I'll say that corporate purchasers are preeminently concerned with offset quality, right? And recent lawsuits have only underscored that. I would say that the endorsement of the CCP by the VCMI, even if for companies who are not planning to make gold, silver, platinum claims under VCMI, that is a strong indicator, right? So watch closely the independent assessment framework process, both for categories, i.e. project types, as well as the programs that are going to be going through that. We've seen Verra in their program announcement this week, say they're going to be going through that process. It looks like there's broad endorsement, so I would expect CCP to emerge as an easy indicator of quality. In the meantime, watch the CORSIA phase 1 approval process. CORSIA, as you know, airline program for reducing emissions that's been used already in the market as a quality standard, right? With the CVL products and the related futures contracts, right? The endorsement by CCP or VCMI rather, as of CORSIA as an interim measure during the CCP independent assessment process bodes well for the use of those credits by corporates. Right now, the CORSIA program is in its transition stage. It's in the pilot phase in 2024. Phase 1 will be started. And right now, the only programs that are approved are the ART registry and ACR. Those are the only the only programs, carbon standards, that are approved for use in phase 1 starting 24. Other programs have conditional approval, right? Verra, others who you're all familiar with, Gold Standard. Don't expect them not to receive that approval. There are some additional things CORSIA wants to see from them. Also, I noticed there's actually a blockchain-based project developer which applied for eligible emission unit status under CORSIA, which I thought was very savvy. But keep an eye on that to see, because ultimately what emissions units get approved, that will drive demand for those emissions units.
That's great, thank you. So going back to something you touched upon in the beginning, Caitlin, this piece about integrity of the market. Rocky Mountain Institute and Climate Collective, actually, I should be honest about the fact that I'm biased about this point, released a paper, an excellent paper. You should all really read it. It's really, really good. Released a very good paper recently. The summary is meaty, and then there's tons and tons of really great slides that dive deep into what the voluntary carbon market is, how it's structured, how it came about, and I think of it as It's a great tool for those of us who've been in these markets for many, many years, but it's also a really nice high-level introduction to what this is and what are the mechanisms and the players across this market. Okay, enough attention to the paper. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the notions. In the paper, we talked a lot about strengthening integrity across the voluntary market needs to be an effort to both strengthen data integrity and process integrity. Obviously, both are linked, but if you're just working on process integrity, you just do another methodology or another process or another criteria or another principle. We really need to strengthen the data integrity across. And the good news is we now actually have technology and available data that can help us do that at scale in a cost-efficient way. So sitting in this interesting place that RMI is with kind of its hands across a lot of entities, can you talk a little bit about the encouraging efforts that you've seen that are actually addressing these things and helping this market move from kind of a bit of a shaky last couple of months into more solid ground?
Yeah. So first, that report, we started it in January right after some headlines, and I think it helped us get our firm understanding over this moment in time in the market. And I think we use this framing of data integrity and process integrity. And what it really means is data integrity refers to like the actual evidence that the credit is either not sending up emissions as expected or pulling them out of the sky as expected. So it's like, is the credit performing to the climate impact, with the climate impact that we expect it to perform? That's data integrity. Process integrity is like, can we trust the way in which the decisions about that credit were made? And how can buyers and rating agencies and like every other institution that has an acronym that you've heard about this morning, how can all of them surface the data about these credits and get to a point where we can differentiate which credits are the really high integrity ones, which are the ones that are really keeping carbon out of the sky for 1,000 years, and which ones have a more effective tool as a short-term mechanism for kind of buying us some time, right? So that's why we framed it that way. And actually, one of my favorite things about the voluntary carbon market is how much innovation and creativity we are seeing in this moment in time. So on the data side, that means the kind of emergence and plethora of technologies and kind of creative solutions about how to gather data about how the credits are performing, how to reimagine or update the methodology. So dynamic baselining, I think, is the one that everybody's really drawn to make sure that we can ground truth the performance over time with like the facts on the ground. And then the kind of how do you crowd in communities so that they are being a part of the solution in terms of gathering the data, helping drive the monitoring and verification processes. The blockchain, the Web3 space provides a lot of solutions, a lot of tools to things like addressing things like double counting, reducing transaction. This is getting into the process side, but kind of the execution and being able to track the data and the credits over time in a transparent way so that there is trust that what people think they are buying and how people think the credits are performing can be anchored into how they are, like the real evidence that this is actually what's happening. And then I'll end with the other thing that happens in the voluntary carbon market space is a lot of people see a solution that the market needs, and they figure out how to bring the resources, the skills, the finance to solve that particular solution, right? And so this is where, Gold Standard is continually iterating on their methodologies and their kind of guidance to the market. With RMI, we've launched a platform called Centergrade, which is going to be a listing platform focused purely on data transparency. So letting other people set the ratings, letting other people handle the certification, we're saying, hey, can we bring in this blockchain technology, take the data that we know is there, and really drill into verification, and just help kind of build trust in all the good work that is already going on.
Fantastic, thank you. Sarah, I get approached by a lot of corporates who ask about, the media around nature-based solutions. It's still aligned with our corporate priorities. We think it's really important. How should we think about this? There's a lot of interesting companies starting to work on biodiversity credits and other types of environmental assets that could potentially have markets, because these are values that we need to protect. We just haven't figured out how to kind of create markets around them. There's a lot we could learn as we're building out biodiversity and nature markets that we can learn from the carbon markets. And one thing that I thought is particularly interesting, where I think maybe these efforts might at some point kind of converge a little bit, is this notion around both beyond value chain mitigation contributions, where a corporate can sort of, beyond looking at decarbonizing their own value chain and then offsetting for the rest, then can actually go beyond and kind of contribute potentially to innovation or contribute to new policy instruments that are really critical. Then Gold Standard also came out with this interesting sort of recognition label or framework around fair contributions, which in my world hopefully will also encompass some of these different types of assets and contributions that we need to move the market forward. Could you tell us a little bit more about how Gold Standard is thinking around this fair contribution effort and how it's linking to some of these other efforts to drive more ambition across the market?
Yeah, absolutely. You said it right when you talked about being very mindful that we use the experience we've had in carbon markets, and then we kind of avoid some of the pitfalls that have emerged through this very dynamic and innovative space that is, again, correcting a market failure. So what we've thought about at Gold Standard is exactly, as you mentioned, Anna, is to take a step back and think about kind of end to end, what does good look like for a company? And the last panel talked a lot about different components of this. And what we thought was a bit missing was a packaging of putting the whole story together. So the paper that we've just published about fairly contributing to net zero is an attempt to put that framework together, and not to recreate the wheel, but to point to best practices, to refer to science-based targets, where appropriate. So maybe just to give a lay of the land of how that sets out, it builds on the WWF corporate blueprint for action in climate and nature. It starts with the very obvious measure and disclose. It moves to setting a science-based target, of course. But then it starts to talk about setting a carbon fee. So you can use an internal shadow price on carbon is very useful. Many companies do so to direct their investment, of course. But an actual fee that we've seen some companies actually set aside using ideally the social cost of carbon, but I think that's one place where there's a lot more work that needs to be done to help different sectors identify what's the appropriate carbon fee that they should be setting aside to allocate to taking responsibility for their unabated emissions. So what we're trying to do there, of course, is then to look at beyond value chain mitigation, how science-based targets is setting out that higher level guidance and making that really operational, giving more detail on how that can be done, and also giving the tools to do so. And so this can apply, of course, in climate, which everyone knows is more mature, but also starting to look at how those complement, conservation efforts, restoration efforts, collective action in supply chains. I hate the word insetting, but I think it communicates something to what people have an understanding of what that might be. How to remove the barriers from investing in, up your supply chain, where there's a free rider problem if one organization is going to invest in a supplier but they're not the full off-taker. How do they get credit for the investment that they've made? And that applies to not only climate mitigation, but also potentially adaptation, and indeed biodiversity. So maybe coming back to the question about markets, I think we need to be very humble and acknowledge that biodiversity is an infinitely more complicated space. There are some excellent first movers who are trying to experiment with what different methodologies could look like for either crediting or potentially claims when you crowd in investment at a landscape level and very effectively monitor the carrying capacity of that ecosystem and what biodiversity claims can come out of that. But I think one of the things that we think is very important is to be humble and to not overclaim at this stage. And it's a bit frustrating because, of course, you want that carrot. You want companies to be able to say in a way that's very simple and very clear to their constituents, I'm nature positive. Let's hold our horses on that. We have a global framework on nature now for 2030. How do we translate that into good practice for companies, and how can market-based mechanisms play a role there is kind of the next frontier, and it'll be really exciting. There's, again, like I said, there's experimentation going on. Gold Standard itself is starting to develop a methodological framework that will allow for different types of claims and potentially credits. So yeah, I think it's a super exciting space. There's opportunity for beyond value chain investment in biodiversity alongside climate, and let's see where it goes.
That's fantastic. I'm going to take the advantage of the last question for you, Michael, and then I have a final question here for the full panel. But Michael, knowing that you sit very closely to both sort of project finance negotiations, but also advising, kind of coming from the legal advisory side, corporates who are making these investments. What is emerging best practice for purchase and sales of carbon removals specifically, and painting this in the light of the development of the VCMI? Are you seeing direct sales? Are you seeing more credits sold by registries? How are people kind of navigating the fact that a lot of these technologies and assets are new and might not have established methodologies, or sort of kind of the traditional path for purchasing might not be there yet?
Yeah, it's a really good question as companies are trying to get their arms around that risk. Removals are different than reductions. A big reason for that the transactions are different is that much more commonly than in a transaction for an avoidance credit, a reduction credit, or a forestry-based project, right? You'll see folks contract for basically the sale of a removal that is not issued on a registry, right? Which is very unusual if you're talking about like an NO2 abatement credit, for example. Reason for that, as you said, right? These are not as established methodologies, right? Like if you're looking to do a DAC project, CCS Plus and ACR are both still in draft form, right? So whereas a contract for purchase and sale of like I'll stick with NO2 abatement is going to just specify the methodology, right? There's a contract for a DAC credit is going to have a much more complicated process for figuring out how you sort of determine what you're selling, right? So you might see a fee for service, right, where folks are going to contract for performance of removals as a service for the buyer, right? You might see folks issue an instrument on their own independent registry. Maybe it's a token, maybe it's something else, or even just a paper transaction where you're selling quote unquote environmental attributes, right, generated by the project, right? So there's a lot of considerations that go into this, and if you're a legal nerd like me and you want to talk about whether it makes more sense to treat it as a commodity or a fee for service, you can see me after the presentation. I'd love to talk about that. But what's interesting is that the VCMI, with the endorsement of this independent assessment framework, seems to be favoring an approach of issuing credits through programs that are approved, right? So based on assuming there's uptake of VCMI and CCP, I would expect to see more transactions favor, I guess what I would call traditional registry credit procurement transactions, purchase and sale of an environmental commodity that is issued by a registry. However, one interesting thing, the answer to this question I think got a lot more interesting this morning. You might have seen the Reykjavik protocol was just announced, which it looks to be a diverse group of stakeholders in the market, in removals in particular, who are putting forward a sort of an overarching quality framework for removals credits that seems to expressly contemplate more of a decentralized approach, not necessarily a registry-driven approach or a carbon standard-driven approach. Too early to say, but it'll be interesting to see if that has uptake with corporate purchasers who continue to want to have the flexibility to contract directly with first movers, fast movers who are finding innovative ways to credit removals without necessarily going through a full registry process.
That's fascinating. I saw the announcement and I was very curious how this is going to play out.
Very interesting.
Very interesting, yes. Being Swedish also, I love that it was Reykjavik. You know, it's
Yeah.
close enough to Sweden to be excited about it.
That's right.
All right, so I have a final question for the panel, and I might start actually, if Sarah will walk us that way. In this room today, also yesterday at some of the events I attended, there are a lot of corporate sustainability officers or groups in corporations that are sitting there scratching their head and saying, what do I do? There are short-term actions they can take. There are more long-term strategies that they can implement. What would, let's say that you put yourself in their seats. How are you thinking about kind of short-term action today versus more long-term kind of strategy, building that out as they go on?
Well, you know, I think the first statement is do something. I think it's, you know, just infinitely frustrating that we see some companies that have been early movers who have invested without the kind of clear frameworks, you know, being lambasted, while those who are doing nothing just kind of fly under the radar. So that's shame on them. I won't blame the media, but we should all be, you know, insisting that every company take full responsibility for their full carbon footprint. I mean, we don't tell people not to reduce and recycle if they haven't got to zero waste. So that's one. So just understanding the responsibility that every company has to help us have a safe operating space that has already been defined by science. And then I would say, you know, I mean, at the risk of, you know, promoting gold standard zone guidance, I think it provides this framework to set out the, you know, management of their own carbon budget. So I would, you know, encourage making sure that you institutionalize responsibility for a carbon footprint throughout the organization, and a fee there's no better way to have accountability than if you're held to a bottom line. So I think dedicating those funds up front, and then being humble in, you know, using carbon credits for sure, and exploring other ways like insetting, like supply chain investments, but just not trying to seek that perfect claim. I think we need to get there eventually, but in the meantime, just be very transparent about what you're doing and not able to do, and then that sets the ground for some, you know, goodwill, I think, with stakeholders.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Caitlin, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I do. So I agree with the don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good mindset. I think, you know, we don't have time, right? Like, we don't have time for every corporation to figure out how to do all their supply chain decarbonization in a perfect way and then come back and say, okay, what's left? We have about 8 years, and we need to kind of be reimagining everything right now. One thing we hear a lot from, and so I absolutely understand the kind of skittishness maybe that's kind of been introduced into the market in the last several years, or definitely this year. I think it's helpful to keep in mind how other markets react to skittishness. So in the stock market, we're in New York, when the stock market drops, nobody says, okay, I should never buy a stock again, right? People, okay, they'll kind of, the market's recorrecting, they'll come back up. I think the carbon market space, like, this has been a learning year, 100%. And I think everybody on this panel, probably everybody in this room, is really committed to addressing some of the data kind of concerns that drove certain journalists, and correcting them. And I think, so look for the evidence that makes you feel confident that the market is moving in the direction you want to move. And the last thing I'll say is, I think there's an incredible amount of innovation in startups. I heard from some this morning, or met a whole bunch last week. I talked to them. RMI has a partner, third derivative, so I talk to their startups all the time. Just incredible creativity in terms of what technologies, what solutions could you come up with if there was a carbon revenue to justify the business. But what I hear from them is that the corporate buyers are really fixated on the story they can put in the PR report, and not on the carbon impact of their actual purchase. So my last piece of advice would be to flip that mindset. so the best story you can tell is a story about how much emission you are actually quantifiably removing or reducing. So focus on that story, and try to let go. I understand there's some complicated internal politics that maybe make that hard, but figure out how to make maybe better balance those at first.
That's awesome, great. Michael.
Yeah, I would say do your due diligence, right? A lot of people are already doing this. You know, a lot of corporates are already investing that time and those resources. I think it's all the more important. VCMI claims code includes a whole annex, you know, expressly for advising corporate purchasers or those using the code on how to go about due diligence for carbon projects. So, you know, so that means, Caitlin, you talked about some of the tools that are available, sort of emerging ratings agencies or layers of MRV that suppliers are baking into their products, right? So look for those, staff up. If you want to hire a law firm, that's great too. But just, go out there and kick the tires on the project. If you want to see something specific, right? If you want to see contractual arrangements that are going to support community, payments, right, or some sort of community participation. If you want to see real property rights that are going to, make sure that the project is going to be able to sort of achieve permanent standards that, that you're looking for, go look for those. Bake those into the contract, right? To say we're not just looking for you to buy a credit, we're also looking for you to do these specific things, right? I can give you an example. If you're looking at DAC contracts right now, a lot of sophisticated purchasers in that market are going to address uncertainty around reversal risk, right? Because maybe ACR is not out yet. We don't know what kinds of program-wide provisions there are. By baking that into the contract, right? By requiring suppliers to set up some kind of a performance security, credit support, letter of credit that's going to backstop the credits that they're purchasing, right? Or some other replacement mechanism, alternate project, whatever it may be, in the event of a reversal, right? So there's a lot of sophisticated ways that folks are addressing a risk associated with this market on their own without necessarily waiting for the registry. So I would encourage all corporate purchasers in the room to start looking at how to do that.